Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this episode of my tutorial video channel. In this episode, I will discuss the relationship between marginal rate of substitution, that is MRS, and marginal utilities of two commodities. In order to understand the relationship between MRS and marginal utilities, we ought to understand what is meant by indifference curve. Indifference curve is a tool for analyzing the theory of demand. It is a technique. Indifference curve is a technique or a tool that enables us analyze the theory of demand. Now, indifference curve is defined as the locus of all the combinations of two commodities that give the consumer same level of satisfaction. That means each of the combinations gives the consumer same level of satisfaction. That is the reason the indifference curve between two commodities slopes downward from left to right. If we draw the diagram, we will get an indifference curve like this. On x-axis we measure consumption of x, and on y-axis we measure consumption of y, and this is the indifference curve. We take 4 points, say P, Q, R and S. This is point P, this is point Q, this is point R, this is point S on the indifference curve. There are innumerable combinations of two commodities X and Y, but for simplicity we have taken only 4 points, that is 4 combinations. Now point P denotes, say, X1 units of X and Y1 units of Y. As the consumer moves down the indifference curve from point P to point Q, he or she consumes X2 units of X and Y2 units of Y. As the consumer further moves down the indifference curve from Q to R, the consumer is consuming X3 units of X and Y3 units of Y. As the consumer further moves down the indifference curve from point R to point S, is consuming X4 units of X and Y4 units of Y. So point P denotes X1, X2, point Q denotes, X1, Y1, point Q denotes X2, Y2, point R denotes X3, Y3, and point S denotes X4, Y4. These are the 4 different combinations, each of which gives the consumer the same level of satisfaction. So the consumer is indifferent between all these combinations. So you can write X1, Y1 is similar to X2, Y2, similar to X3, Y3, which is similar to X4, Y4. In order to live on the same indifference curve, that is, in order to remain indifferent between all the points on the indifference curve, the indifference curve itself must be sloping downward from left to right. That is, if the consumer has to remain on the same indifference curve, then if he increases consumption of one commodity, then he has to sacrifice consumption of another commodity. Here, as the consumer is moving down from point P to point S, his consumption of Y is falling, whereas his consumption of X is rising. Okay, if one commodity is consumed more, then another commodity, the consumption of another commodity has to be sacrificed so that the consumer remains indifferent between all those combinations. Now marginal rate of substitution this means the rate at which one commodity is substituted for another commodity. When you say marginal rate of substitution of X for Y, we write like this: MRS sub XY. This means marginal rate of substitution of X for Y. Now as the consumer is moving down from point P to Q, then to R, and then finally to S, his consumption of Y is falling and consumption of X is rising. If we take point P on another diagram, this is say point P and this is a point Q. As the consumer moves down the indifference curve from point P to point Q, then he is sacrificing delta Y of Y to gain delta X of X. That means delta Y is sacrificed by the consumer to gain delta X of commodity X. So this is the rate. The rate of substitution at point P is then delta Y by delta X. Right? So MRS is equal to MRS of X for Y is equal to delta Y by delta X. At point P it is delta Y by delta X. Now if the consumer goes on consuming one additional unit of X, then we can see that the value of delta Y by delta X is falling because sacrifice of Y is falling while the gain of X remains same, because the consumer is consuming one additional unit of X as the consumer is moving down from one point to another on the indifference curve. So delta Y by delta S is falling, and this is the reason the indifference curve slopes downward from left to right. Now if the consumer has to remain indifferent between point P and point Q, then the utility is sacrificed by sacrificing consumption of Y must be equal to the utility gained by consuming more of X. So utility sacrificed of Y is equal to utility gained of X. Only then the consumer can be indifferent between point P and point Q. Now what is the total utility that consumer is sacrificing when the consumer is moving from P to Q? Utility sacrificed is equal to delta Y multiplied by marginal utility of Y and utility gained is equal to delta X into marginal utility of X. Isn't it? At point P, the consumer is consuming this much of X, say X1, and this much of Y, say Y1. So the total utility the consumer gets by consuming X1 units of X and Y1 units of Y must be equal to, if this is X2 and this is Y2, must be equal to the utility the consumer derives by consuming X2 units of X and Y2 units of Y. only then the consumer can remain indifferent between P and Q. So the utility sacrificed must be equal to the utility gained. So delta y into marginal utility of y must be equal to delta x into marginal utility of x. So delta y into mu y is equal to delta x multiplied by marginal utility of x. Now by transposing we get delta y divided by delta x is equal to marginal utility of x divided by marginal utility of y. Therefore we can say that the marginal rate of substitution between x and y, or MRS of x for y, is equal to the ratios of marginal utilities of two commodities. Now this is the ultimate relationship between MRS xy and ratios of utilities of x and y. Okay. In my previous videos on indifference curve, I have explained in detail what is meant by indifference curve, what are the properties of indifference curve, and what are the expressions of indifference curve, what is corner solution. All these things have been discussed by me in earlier videos. You can watch those videos for better and greater insight. For this video, I think it is enough. Now, I believe this is well understood by you. Still, should you have any doubt in your mind, if you have any query, please don't hesitate to let me know through the comment box. I shall be very glad to reply to all your relevant queries. If you think this video is beneficial for you, please do share the video with your friends, brothers, sisters and colleagues so that they can also get benefit by watching this video. And finally, thank you very much for watching the video. Stay well and goodbye.